recognizes that developed countries at least are obligated to extend economic assistance to developing nations, and an extensive body of rules, agreements, institutions, and procedures has been designed to facilitate and regulate assistance efforts. The vast and diverse networks of international rules, agreements, and institutions facilitating and regulating world trade in resources include the bilateral and multilateral commercial agreements for specific exchanges of commodities or establishing broad rules to encourage mutual trade and investment. We also have arrangements such as the General Arrangement on Tariffs and Trade for mutual reduction or removal of tariffs and other discriminatory barriers to trade. Agreements such as Loan Convention to foster trade among specific groups of developing nations, organizations of resource producing nations such as OPEC, or of resource importing nations such as International Energy Agency to strengthen bargaining powers or to deal with common concerns. Even before COVID-19 pandemic, many people around the globe understood that inequality was undermining their life chances and opportunities. They saw a world out of balance, they felt left behind, they saw economic policies channeling resources upwards to the privileged few. That is according to Antonio Guterres, the ninth Secretary General of the UN. The UN also urges states to leave no one behind and don't forget commitments in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Before COVID-19 pandemic, there was low economic growth. That puts a big burden. Working capital is much needed to accelerate growth. The onset of pandemic resulted to slow all the more the economic growth. Under the Philippine setting, that under the Duterte administration, let me mention that Duterte welcomed the UN's COVID-19 response and recovery fund designed to help low to middle income countries like the Philippines get back on their feet after a crippling blow of the pandemic. As regards vaccine, it was stressed by our president that an effective COVID-19 vaccine must not be denied or withheld from any country, whether rich or poor. He said there should be universal access to a vaccine and that it should be considered a global public good. He was very much worried and he warned that tensions between world powers could escalate to the detriment of countries. When elephants fight, it is the grass that gets trampled. He was worried that a world war between two countries with great military might could deteriorate into a real war of nuclear weapons and missiles. As regards migrant workers, Duterte called on all countries to protect the rights of migrant workers, especially as they lose their livelihoods due to the pandemic. He thanked governments who had given assistance to overseas Filipino workers and mentioned his administration's efforts to bring them home. Despite the pandemic, the Philippines still aims to reach the sustainable development goals set by the UN, such as ending poverty. Countries with limited resources still have an obligation to ensure an adequate standard of living. Even in times of crisis, governments are required to make every effort to meet this obligation with existing resources, including international assistance, and allocate them in the way that maximizes respect for human rights, including taking into account the precarious situation of disadvantaged and marginalized individuals or groups. States have obligations to use the maximum of their available resources to combat COVID-19 and realize the right to health. We also consider the permissibility of limitations and derogation of states' obligation in this connection. In short, in the context of COVID-19, states have obligations to reprioritize and focus existing resources, whether financial, human, technological, or natural. They must also act to expand existing resources, whether through support from other states or private sources to ensure the realization of the right to health. The United Nations issued a checklist for human rights-based approach to socio-economic country responses to COVID-19 to guide us in the maximum use of resources. When and if the answer to this question will be in the affirmative, then the country is having a human rights-based approach to socio-economic country responses to COVID-19. And the first question is with regard to access of resources without discrimination to food, essential healthcare, clean water, adequate housing, and essential levels of social protections. The same question was posed as regard the fiscal and economic reforms aimed to deploy maximum available resources, including through progressive taxation. If retrogression is unavailable, fiscal and economic policies should be aimed at ensuring that the retrogression is temporary, legitimate, reasonable, proportionate, non-discriminatory, and protective of the minimum core obligations of economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as consistent with the requirements of transparency, participation, and accountability as designed and adopted. It should also incorporate the human rights impact assessments, and they should address the issues that will arise therefrom. Are they geared towards ensuring that the national revenue is sufficient to ensure that minimum core obligations are met? Donors should refrain also from attaching conditions to their financing that could undermine the state's ability to respect, protect, and fulfill its human rights obligations in the allocation of resources and design of policies. Are these grants or loans from IFIs and donors monitored, including by NHRIs and civil society organizations, to ensure that they are used to address demonstrated needs with a focus on those most at risk of being left behind? In view of the COVID-19 pandemic, wherein almost all the countries of the world has been affected, even the countries belonging to this G7 or G20 group of nations have suffered not only in terms of medical and health issues, but as well as economic and social issues. Recession looms even in the strongest economies of US and China. GNP and other economic indicators are practically plunging and stock markets remain bearish. These developed nations who had been in the past supplied and shared the resources to the global South countries, whether they may have considered it their obligation or a treaty which they are party to, in the light of the pandemic justified in differing from, interrupting, or even deviating from its legal international obligations. With regard to the fundamental notion of wrongfulness, that's guided by Chapter 5 of Part 1, which enumerates circumstances of precluding wrongfulness, what in a forensic context would be called defenses, the legal justification that may be invoked applying RCWA or consent, self-defense, and necessity in relation to pandemic. The right to invoke responsibility is lost in two cases set out by Article 45. The first is where such right has been waived by the injured state, either with regard to the breach itself or some or all its consequences. The waiver has to be clear and unequivocal. And to conclude, everything we do during and after this crisis of COVID-19 must be with a strong focus on building more equal, inclusive, and sustainable economies and societies that are more resilient in the face of pandemics, climate change, and many other global challenges we face. Thank you and good afternoon.